Okay, welcome to April, the Thursday. So our first two sessions are in this room. Starting off with Kate Temoney, who introduced one of my favorite religion scholars, religion and genocide scholars, introduced by one of my other favorite religion and genocide scholars, probably here, Jason Bruner. And then we'll also have Elisa Vanyo in this room before we move to Mirabella at 1 p.m. for the screening of Aurora's Sunrise, which is exciting, award-winning film, Armenia's entry into the Oscars, and we'll have a couple, Matthias Mittman and Beatrice Noyes as well at Mirabella. So it's going to be a full day. So we're going to start here till 11:45, and then by 1 we'll be moving to Mirabella. So I will turn it over to my unit head, favorite colleague, scholar of religion, Jason Bruner, to introduce wonderful Kate.
All right, thank you, Tim. Congratulations on having a morning of favorites.
I made the list.
Well, it's my privilege to introduce this morning's speaker. Dr. Kate Temoney is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Religion at Montclair State University. She's the American Academy of Religion Co-Chair of the Religion, Holocaust, and Genocide Unit, a member of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Committee on Ethics, Religion, and the Holocaust, and an editor for Genocide Studies and Prevention, an international journal. Trained as a comparative ethicist, religious ethicist, she earned Florida State University. Dr. Temoney's work addresses the intersections of religion, genocide, human rights, and theory of history. In addition to national and international guest lectures, as well as presentations to government and non-governmental agencies, her scholarship appears in several journals and edited volumes, including Anatomizing White Rage, Race is My Religion and White Genocide, and the book, The Religion of White Rage, The War Came Alive Inside of Them, Genocidal Rape, Religion and Moral Injury in the Journal of Religious Ethics, and Religion and Genocide Studies in the forthcoming Handbook of Genocide Studies. So please join me in welcoming very accomplished Dr. Kate Temoney, who will present on those who have the sin, go to this side, intersections of religion and genocide. So welcome.
Thank you. It's my absolute pleasure to be here. And I would like to start with several thanks. So one of them is, of course, to thank Becky, who has been phenomenal to work with so far as making sure everything goes with this conference. Tim, whose invitation I greatly appreciate. I wouldn't be here if he hadn't lobbied to bring me here. So thank you. And of course, our ASU hosts have been phenomenal. I feel quite at home here. Also like to thank the students who have come out and had great conversations with. It's very edifying to be able to talk to students who are excited about your work. I also like to thank my friend who's here, a friend of 20 years, who's also teaches courses here and works here, who came out to see me. All of you who are here at 9:00 a.m. on a 4th day of this event. Those of you who are online, thank you so much for joining us. And then also this image, which many of you may not know, actually the artist is here, which is Sienna, who is a student who is responsible for this image that many of us have been using in our presentations, and it's been online, so thank you. So that truly is an amazing piece. So a testament to the students who are here. And then last, as others have done, I'd also like to acknowledge the fact that we are on the ancestral land of the Pima and the Maricopa. So of course, without them, we would not be here. So that's also something I would like to add. So thank you again. I really am grateful to be here. So what we have here in this presentation, those who have the sin go to the side, is a quote. And I often will use quotes in some of my pieces. So for instance, one of the ones that Jason kindly quoted is called "The War Came Alive Inside of Them." And it actually is a quote from a tribunal case, a woman who was sexually assaulted, and that's how she described her experience, was that the war came alive inside of her. In this particular instance, those who have the sin go to the side is actually from a documentary film that came out, I believe it was about 2011. And it was a BBC documentary. And the title of the piece is called Roger Genocide, maybe. And the titular figure, Roger, was actually a boy who was smuggled out during the 1994 genocide. And the film follows him then coming back now as a teenager to see if he can actually forgive the perpetrators who killed his father. And he indicates, I think I might get there, but not right now, right? That was basically his response. And this particular quote is from the documentary. There is a woman named Miss Jojo. She's a Rwandan musician, and she talks about the genocide and her experience through her music. And so in the documentary, as she's talking about her experience, she indicates that when her mother was shot, that armed militia came into her home. And as they came in, they said, those of you with the sin go to this side, those of you without the sin go to this side. And what that meant was that those of you who are Tutsi, right, you are those who have the sin, you go to this side. Those of you who are Hutu, you do not have the sin, you go to this side, so that they could summarily execute those who had segregated themselves. So this is where that particular line comes from. And I use that as an opening to talk about these intersections of religion and genocide, because we have people here using religious rhetoric, and it's not uncommon to somehow some of the language that happens not only during the perpetration of genocides, but even sometimes in wrestling with what has happened after a genocide supposedly has ended, how people try to grapple with what has happened often will reach for religious language. This is something that Geddes, for instance, has noted, and Bergen, because the idea is that this is something so like unfathomable, or it's something that seems so just horrible, that even if people don't profess to be religious in the sense of being a part of any institutionalized religion, you'll often see publications that come out, and even people who use this language, like the angels have left us, or shaking hands with the devil, right? Even again, people who aren't necessarily religious. So this is one of the reasons why I like to talk about this concept, because even though I'm mostly going to focus on institutionalized religion, I also want to bring our attention to the kind of quote unquote religious language that sometimes people use in order to talk about these atrocities. I also like to focus your attention on truth in advertising. I often will wear the same outfit as the image. I'm here, it's just kind of fun to see people notice. And I've also had a lot of fun with my last name. My last name is Temoney, Temoney, I take them all. And the joke is that my mom wanted to marry a man with money, but this doesn't quite what she had in mind. And so I have a lot of fun. So where we're going to go with each other now is I'm hoping that this will be I'm hoping this will be relatively interactive. I know it can be difficult to kind of focus for 45 or 50 minutes. And so one thing I would just like to ask, because we often have questions at the end, but one thing I'd like to ask at the beginning is that when you think of religion and genocide, what comes to mind when you think of religion and genocide, or even when you decided online, or when you decided to come to this talk, what came to mind when you thought of religion and genocide? Anyone? The Holocaust. The Holocaust, all right. So you think of what we often see as like a paradigmatic genocide. You think of genocide, you think of Holocaust. One other person?
Students often think it's the cause of it. If there's no religion, there'd be no war or conflict.
Okay.
Not true.
Not true, exactly. And what's interesting is that comes from a phrase where people often say more wars have been started in the name of God and the other, which actually isn't true, right? But you're right, but I think there is that general supposition, right, that that's the case. So maybe in religion and genocide, they get usual suspect, right? Of course, religion's involved, right? So there might be lots of ways that we think about religion and genocide.
Two things that are difficult to define and that you're not supposed to talk about.
Exactly. And you can imagine, people often say, which is really great, they say, they don't know necessarily what I study, but then when they do, they make this comment. So you can imagine at the dinner, religion, genocide, no, it's at the table, right? On a plane, evidently everybody's interested, you know, in, right? When they find out what I might study. But I also get but you seem so nice. You know, like you seem so cheery. You know, how do you study religion and genocide? Right? So when we look at these two things together, what I would like to share with you today is kind of three things. One is looking at kind of how it happens out in the world, like how we see religion, institutional religion, actors, rhetoric, individuals, actors, how we see and looking at different cases of genocide, what kind of interaction or nexuses we see, right? So that's one way of thinking about this. And I'm mostly going to do this through looking at models, right? Different models that I've come across in my own research. And then of course I had my own model. Of course, I got to put my stamp on it, right? So I have my own model. Then second, also talking about how we have seen historiographically, how we as genocide and Holocaust scholars have often written about these different genocides, right? In relationship to religion, which is kind of almost like a lit review in some ways, like what have you seen? And then last, and this is a piece actually that just came out, so a little shameless self-promotion, is that this text literally just came out last month. And it's called Handbook of Genocide Studies. It's by Elgar Press. It's edited by David Simon and Leora Khan. And I have a chapter that's in this book, and you'll see a little more about it toward the end of this presentation. But the third part, or the third kind of component of this presentation I'd like to share with you is that there also seems to be, in my mind, this kind of spate of edited volumes and uptake of interest in religion and genocide in ways that we haven't seen before. And I kind of like to make an argument that is not what we call a post-secular, in the sense of like positioning religion as a more prominent way of understanding conflicts or understanding the world, is that it's not a post-secular turn. It may like a bend, right? You know, like there seems to be this phenomenon going on. So I'll kind of show you this kind of map of why I think that may be the case. And this particular piece I just wrote is my way of kind of talking about religion and genocide studies, the absence mostly of religious scholars actually in talking about genocide, and then what seems to be this uptick, right? So I'm trying to give you a kind of phenomenological kind of point of view, like how do we see religion and genocide interacting, kind of how we kind of written about it, and then third, what I see within genocide studies, what seems to be an uptick in interest. And not only in genocide studies, but also, as Jason mentioned, I was very, very fortunate to be invited by the US State Department to actually give a presentation. I've had a think tank, the Stimson Center, that contacted me. So increasingly also governmental and non-governmental organizations are also interested in talking about this, right? It seems to be really burgeoning. So in talking about this overview, I like to do this in two ways. So an overview in the sense of looking at the presentation itself, kind of what I just went over a moment ago. But then also overview in the sense of kind of a bird's eye view of what I'm talking about when I talk about religion and genocide. And so one place to start is that, and this is obligatory, by the way, whenever anybody writes about religion and genocide, well, what's religion, right? Well, what's genocide, right? Like, let's get that out of the way first, because you have to be very clear about what you mean by this. Not everybody means the same thing. And so within the parameters of what you're going to discuss, typically people just choose whatever best serves, whatever point that they're trying to make. And so I do the same thing in much of my writing. And so when we talk about religion and genocide, religion here again, I'm talking mostly about institutionalized religions, we call traditional religions. I'm not really talking about, say, like political religions, for example, although there certainly has been writing about that, about Malice, traditions, so that exists, but that's not really the focus of my presentation. And then in talking about genocide, most people do, not most, I'll say a lot of people will default to the UN convention, but there's been a lot of recent pushback on that and continues to be pushback on whether or not that's really the most useful framework for talking about genocide is to rely on this legal definition. I often in my work do cite that because I do have an interest in prevention. And because of prosecution issues and because of prevention issues, sometimes that is one of the more useful ways to talk about genocide. But I also talk about genocide in the sense of the elimination of culture and not just the killing of people, right? Or even just large mass atrocities or even genocides that aren't recognized as part of the canon of genocide, right? So I often do that as well. So here, I mostly am going to be talking about what are recognized, what we call the canon of genocide, but that's not the exhaustive of my work. And when we talk about the canon, and this is something I think Tim mentioned yesterday, is that Alex Hinton has been a part of, as well as other scholars, have been a part of what we call critical genocide studies, which is really trying to, it sounds like what it sounds like, this being critical of our own field, which is relatively new, by the way. So if you look at Holocaust studies, starts around 70s, 80s, genocide studies grows out of Holocaust studies, and that's in the 80s, right? So if you think about it as people who are professionally looking at this, that's not very long ago. And so then we kind of come at this crossroads. Okay, we've been at this for a while now. Kind of where are we, right? We're kind of taking stock. And so part of that has to do with what we call the paradigmatic of the canon. So for instance, you shared one, which is the Holocaust, right? What are other ones that you might think are part of the canon, or what we see as like the kind of central what we call the 20th century core, right, of those genocides that often come up when you think of genocide. So one's definitely the Holocaust. Rwanda would be another one. Armenia. Yeah, Bosnia, right? What's going on with the Uyghurs, right? So the 20th century core tends to be those like Rwanda, Bosnia, right? The Holocaust, Armenia. Then you have some that are considered like kind of on the periphery, right? Some that are lesser known. So there's like Guatemala, indigenous peoples. So there are lots of other ones like Namibia, right? The Herero people. So we're mostly going to be talking about the Holocaust, Rwanda. So I am going to be in some ways reinforcing that canon. And so what I'm talking about, but I just kind of want to let you know as a field, there is a lot of interest in expanding that canon. So that's one place to start. Another place to start would be to talk about what I have in that a lot of what we talk about with religion and genocide, some of those early works were things like memoirs, right? Or people's reflections and their experiences. And so in that case, there was a lot of emphasis on things like rescue efforts, right? So this was my experience. And a lot of the traditions that were part of these rescue efforts were the ones that were right. So there seemed to be what I call like the 3 R's. There was this emphasis like on rescue. There was this emphasis on some of the relief efforts, right, that people provided who were of a particular religious community. And there's also kind of an emphasis on reconciliation and the role that they played, things like forgiveness or setting up particular opportunities for some kind of coming together in order to move through a tragedy. So the 3 R's, there's a lot of emphasis on that. There seems to be less on what I call the 2 P's, which are prevention, which again, we're starting to see a lot more now. People are interested in how religious actors, religious institutions can be involved in religion prevention. And the second would be perpetration, right? More emphasis on, well, what are the underpinnings of some of these genocidal conflicts that religion fit in? And so you have people like David Little or Stephen Jacob or John Roth, right? This philosopher. One is actually a religion, and who have all pointed out that this Bartop and Mack would be another one, right? So there are all these scholars who've said, as early as like say 2000, and as recently as like 2009 and 2014, who say that religion is kind of mostly overlooked, right, when it comes to looking at genocidal conflicts. And so we really need to talk about perpetration, right? We really need to talk about the ideological underpinnings or some of the kind of systematic aid that's provided. Right? We really need to look at the religion and the role that it plays, because there really wasn't much being written about the position that many of these traditions were taking, say, on mass killing. And then Roth also points out that, and this is a really common phrase too, is that religious institutions or ideology or actors aren't usually the reason why a genocide unfolds, but it's usually what we call like an agitating factor, or as we see, and I'll talk about a little more, or Helen Fine, who mentions that, well, it can sometimes be the difference as to whether a genocidal campaign is successful or not, even if religion is not necessary or the causal factor. And so that's one of the reasons why I find it so interesting to look at this, because when we look at governmental institutions, sometimes religious institutions are sometimes one of the most powerful and most organized kind of systems that we have in societies, juxtaposed with governments, especially in a situation where a government is failing, right? That religious institutions have quite a bit of authority and power. So there really is a lot to be learned, I think, from looking at the role of religion in genocides. That's another place to start. Is to say, here's what we kind of see, and then here's maybe where we can start talking about a different trajectory in how we think about these things. The last place we'll start, and then I'll start getting into the models, would be to think about historically, how do we think about religion and genocide? And here, when I say genocide, I'm not just talking about the 1948 UN Convention. I think we're pretty much past arguments that, well, you can't really label something a genocide as a word that exists before, 1948, like that's rubbish, right? I mean, but those arguments have been made. So I will refer to genocide that happened prior to 1948. And so one way to talk about this too, and this is where I'm going to show you a short clip, is that we could say, well, maybe when we talk about genocide, we could look at, say, the Hebrew Bible, right? So some people will say, well, if we look at the Hebrew Bible, roughly when we look at then the advent of Christianity, and then we have the Holy Bible, which includes the New Testament, which also includes, the Old Testament, which is roughly some of the same literature that's in the Hebrew Bible. They'll say, well, look, you already have theological warrants, right, in the Old Testament or in the Hebrew Bible, and you already have a genocidal impulse there, right? So you see this, say, in Deuteronomy or in Joshua or in 1 Corinthians. It seems to be this command to wipe out entire peoples. Some people say this is hyperbole, right? That you really need to understand what warfare was like during that period. Other people say, I don't care if it's hyperbole, it's disturbing, right? That there would be a situation where divine, all-loving God would command the destruction of, in this case, like the Canaanites, right, of entire peoples. Right, so if you want to talk about religion and genocide, you'll often have people reach back and say, well, look, you already have this genocidal impulse in the putting together these early texts. You have others, and this is where the clip's going to come in, I'm about to show you, where a gentleman named Routledge Handbook, who did a docuseries in 2021, and it's called Exterminate All the Roots. And here he talks about the kind of the coming together of kind of race and blood, and how that formed what we would then start to see in starting with the Crusades is kind of religious ideology playing a role in the mixture of kind of race and blood and identity being a basis for extermination. And I'm going to show you the short clip. It's several minutes long, and it does a couple of things. So I'll give you a little context. So I had the great opportunity of working with Tim during a seminar last summer. We actually showed all 4 parts of this docuseries. And again, it's called Exterminate All the Roots by Routledge Handbook. Some of you may have known I'm Not Your Negro. He's off, that's the same director. And this is a piece on Baldwin, on James Baldwin. So this is the same gentleman. And when he did this docuseries, he based it on 3 books. And so the 3 books, he uses the title, Exterminate All the Roots, is from one of those books, and that's by Sven Lindquist. And you'll see in the clip that we're going to show you in a moment, that Becky and I are going to show you in a moment, he'll talk about that. So the opening scene, you'll hear his voice, you'll hear Routledge's voice, and he'll say, Sven taught me this, right? So that's what he's talking about. And Sven is no longer with us. He died not long, actually. He died during the production, I think, of the series. So Exterminate All the Roots is one book that it's based on, where he looks at a history of imperialism and colonialism and then links that to other mass atrocities. Second, he has a Routledge Handbook, uses another book, which is called Silencing the Past by Michel Waltereau, who looks at the Haitian Revolution, right, and looks at how we often talk about history in ways that purposely silences certain people and certain voices. And Routledge Handbook is very invested in trying to bring those voices to the fore. And then the third book is Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's An Indigenous People's History of the United States. So this Exterminate All the Roots is based on these 3 books. And this 4-part docuseries tries to link, and this is where religion comes in the clip, he tries to link religion to the origins of white supremacy. And he says in that colonialism, imperialism, that white supremacy that we see running as a thread through the extermination of indigenous peoples and the genocide of Native people in the Americas, the mass atrocity of slavery, which, as we saw from our presentation yesterday, that some people actually do refer to as a genocide. And then third, the Holocaust. And so I'm going to show you, it's like maybe not even 3 minutes. It's a clip from the very first part of the series. So 4 parts. This is the first part. And I think it's visually stunning. And you'll see this tracing, if you will, of the origins of white supremacy and how he links these 3 mass atrocities together.
Tells me you already know enough. So do I. It's not knowledge we lack. What is missing is the courage to understand what we know and to draw conclusions. Now, when the story started, we know now when race, color, and blood became institutionalized for the first time. We saw it taking form with the Crusades, when the Christian kingdoms of northern Spain, together with the church leadership and other European monarchies, decided to take over Muslim-controlled trade routes to the Far East. The ultimate goal of the church, the European rulers, was never just about winning souls to Christianity. It was also about gaining wealth and power through annihilation. In 1478, the Pope approved the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition, which had to investigate the cleanliness of blood of Moorish and Jewish converts. Clean blood was Christian European. Unclean blood was savage. No. Origin the ideology of white supremacy. Well, the concept of race based on blood was used as law. White supremacy made it possible for Europeans to think it was acceptable to enslave or exterminate other peoples. Led to the mass deportation of Jews from Spain in 1492 and Muslims in the following decades. It ended with the forced deportation of more than 10 million Africans from the human motherland. It happened to native peoples in what came to be called the United States of America. In the 20th century, without any contrition, it happened during the Holocaust. The earliest days of Christendom, peaceful, also leads straight to the heart of America.
Okay, right. So again, if we want to talk about this intersection of religion and genocide, and if we're not just talking about actors, but also about ideologies and underpinnings, right? This is another place where you might start talking about the intersections of religion and genocide and its connection to white supremacy and imperialism and the basis for the institutionalization of race and blood in a way that actually justify the extermination of entire peoples. The last place is kind of the idea of a starting point, of course, would be to talk about where we see religion and genocide coming together in the literature, right? And so that's part of what I'm going to be talking about here later in a moment. So let's do this first part that I alluded to earlier of how we see religion and genocide interacting in conflicts. And so one thing that's been brought up during our time together is that genocides often happen alongside wars. And so what we see here is that we have these different scholars who try to look at different models of how we've talked about this. And it doesn't always, but often involve some kind of state apparatus. And so I have here just 4 people that I decided to highlight. I specifically chose people from different disciplines, different training. There are also people whose work I admire and people that I've worked with. And I'll share that although there certainly have been, and you'll see this when I show you this kind of image at the end of all these different books that have come out, is that there have been certainly books about specific conflicts in religion. So for instance, one of the best books and well-known books is Michael Selz's book, The Bridge Portrayed, which is about what happened in Bosnia and Serbia, right? And he specifically talks about things like, like mythical underpinnings, that, the rituals that attended, the different religious traditions and the conflicts and historical conflicts that they had, right? You have somebody like Timothy Longman, who writes a book about Christianity and the churches in Rwanda, right? So it's not as though there haven't been books that have focused on that. But what I'm looking at here are people who do more like comparative genocide, who are looking across genocide. So that's what I'm focusing on mostly today. But that's not to say that there haven't been some really phenomenal books that take deep dives into specific conflicts. One of the recent one is looking at Terror in the Land of the Holy Spirit, which is by Gina Gerard, and she actually looks at Riyad Mas and Guatemala, right? So there are specific cases. So, but here we're not focusing on specific conflicts and religion, but kind of writ large. How about we talk about the intersection of religion and genocide? So one I offer to you is what's called a diagnostic schematic by this gentleman, who is Sumner Twist. He also happens to be my dissertation advisor, this gentleman. And he looks at it, and he uses almost kind of like medical language. Some of these words like precondition, precipitating factors, you often see this in medical. But here, this appears in Religion and Politics and Genocide. Preconditions, when he talks about religion, he's referencing things like some of the religious, like ethno-religious identities, and some of the kind of religiously tinged language that sometimes attends nationalistic talk as a pre-existing kind of condition. So are there certain factors at play that allow something like violence to unfold? So that's what he's looking at. So far as precipitating factors, here we're looking at what you might call triggers, right? So something that might set something off. And sometimes that can be specific antagonisms between religious traditions can sometimes be that. Sometimes having an authoritarian government often is part of a potential triggering, right? Especially if there's some kind of strife, like an economic collapse or something like that. That could be a triggering event. Third is what he calls the primary process. And here he's looking at leaders, right? So people who are leaders in these communities, some of them, again, who are often employing religious rhetoric, right, as a way of kind of whipping up the masses. But he really wants to specifically talk about some of those religious, say, actors and institutions who are either full-throatedly supporting violence, actually maybe committing some of these acts themselves, or at the very least, aren't doing anything, right? Or just and kind of staying silent. So that's where religion comes in for him. And then the secondary process is where he's looking at bystanders, like where he's looking at not at the leaders, right? Not the institutions and not the leaders who are not saying things or sometimes are full-throatedly supporting the genocidal campaign. He's looking at the bystanders, right? He's looking at the ordinary folk, if you will, and then how they may actually take on the ideology of those that they're working with, or sometimes themselves be like whipped into a frenzy to participate, right? So that's what he means by that secondary process. So he specifically doesn't focus on looking at post-genocide, like reconciliation. He just wants to focus on this element. Then, and again, he's actually trained his degrees in religion, he's trained as a religion and philosophy. Somebody else whose work I really admire is Doris Bergen. And she's a very clear writer and just brilliant person. I've had the pleasure of interacting with her several times. She's an historian. And she has a piece that appears in an edited volume. So this is a book, this is a chapter in an edited volume. This is also a chapter in an edited volume. And her piece is called Religion and Genocide, an Historiographical Survey. So she really is focusing on how have we seen people writing about, right? How have historians written about these genocides when it comes to religion? So she looks at, and she looks at this in what she calls 4 ways. One is to look at religion as a motivating or legitimating force. So people, again, see because they're sanctioned by text that seems to justify what they're doing, or that there are religious individuals who seem to be urging them on or forgiving them, right? If they do engage in activities that would otherwise, be insinuated or even illegal. So that's what she means when she says motivating or legitimating force. She also looks at a target. So for instance, if you look at the convention, is that a religious identity can be a reason why you're targeted, right? It's one of the enumerated protected groups within the Genocide Convention. So it could be a marker for your extermination. So that's what she means by targeting. But it can also be a source of, right? There are many people who see their religious tradition as a haven, right, during this time. Rituals persist, right? The communities persist. The belief that at some point their tradition, their beliefs, or their community will be delivered from the particular horrors that they're enduring, right? So that's what she says is a source of comfort for many people. Also, it can be what she calls a break against brutality. So there have been times where we do see rescue behavior, for instance. There can be certain elements of why you may or may not act, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But she does want to just focus on the downside or the darker side of religion. But she also wants to say, but look, there's also potential for good there. Of course, I also believe the same thing, as do many scholars. Probably one of the best pieces we've seen on this is Scott Appleby's The Ambivalence of the Sacred, right, which very clearly tries to lay out, look, religion is a practice amongst humans, right? And so why would religion be any less susceptible to also, being a place or a kind of avenue for action, that's considered destructive. And so here she also wants to look at both sides of the coin and not just say like, this is awful or evil, or it's the reason why more violence has ever been perpetrated is because of God, right? She wants to get away from that kind of narrative. And then she also wants to look at it as its healing or concealing factor. So again, so this goes back to post-genocide, when you have religious institutions and actors, and when you actually talk to people. I remember there was an interview, and I saw this both in the Rwandan case and the Bosnian case, where despite the fact that there were religious antagonisms that were just so palpable as part of those conflicts, and you actually had religious figures who were full-throatedly supporting and even providing support for these kinds of actions, is that people still, on the whole, felt as though religious actors should be part of the reconciliation process. And so it's not uncommon then for people to be able to then look to those communities or look to those figures as part of their healing process. But then also, which is an interesting point, she also talks about the concealing factor. And this concealing factor is actually something that kind of dovetails with something that Waller also does, which I'll talk about in a second, which is that sometimes religious or institutions or religious individuals, if they were part of the perpetrator group, they will actually point to their suffering in the events. Like, well, actually, we suffered, and we had, and we actually had to act because we were actually going to be retaliated against it. So we had to act, and so there's this idea of trying to conceal or downplay the role that your community has played by actually claiming that you've actually been victimized, which in some ways tries to paper is a very revisionist way of trying to understand the conflict. These last two models, institutional response stages, is what Waller proposes. He's actually a psychologist. And so his piece is called Religion and Evil in the Context of Genocide. And here he looks at just institutional religion, right? So he's looking at specifically how institutions and culture intersect, and then how we can see that intersecting in the unfolding of genocidal violence. So he looks at culture. Here, he's talking about authority. Like he says that religious traditions often instill a kind of authority and obedience to authority that can also make people more susceptible to actually obeying orders when it comes to being involved in the active suppression or killing of other peoples. He also looks at the othering effect, right? What we call often the us and them. part of religious traditions whereby, and this is going to get really elaborated on in this last model I want to talk about, but this us and them kind of culture whereby there's a kind of transcendent element of many religious traditions or concerns about ultimacy that sometimes can really make a person so radically other that they're targeted for extermination, maybe not even human. And then the last one is what he calls the institutional church. And here he really is talking a lot about the concealment factor. So, and here, something again we talked about earlier in the week is denial, right? So he wants to talk about the role of institutional churches in denial, concealment, papering over of their own involvement within these genocides. So that's his model. This last one is by Stephen Jacobs. He's actually went to seminary. He's at the University of Alabama. He's in a religion department. And then he really focuses on the monotheistic traditions, which he thinks kind of lend themselves to an exclusivism, right? Because there is just but the one God, right? And like there are no other gods. And so he talks about tribalism, which again is very much the community of us and them. But then he also wants to talk about exclusivism, whereby it's not just us and them, it's also we're superior to you, right? So it's not just that we're different, it's that we're superior. And then that, and all of his kind of slide into each other, like he'll always say this one leads to this one leads to this one. And then he'll go into third, the privileged access to the divine. Well, because our particular group is superior to yours, we have a particular line, right, to the divine, by which we define our exclusivism. And that provides a kind of justification or kind of certainty about what it is that we're doing. And then the last one he says, and that there's a particularistic and parochial reading. So that certainty often comes from a very specific and narrow reading of texts. So you can see how he really tries to weave all four of those together. All of these, by the way, even though they're presented like it's 1, 2, 3, and 4, they're not necessarily meant to be linear. And this is something that came up, I think it was 2 days ago, and looking at, say, Greg Stanton's 10 Stages of Genocide. I had an opportunity to talk to him. He actually was a guest speaker for a class. And one of the things that my students that we asked is like, now that you have all this time, to look at the stages, what kind of feedback have you gotten? And he goes, yeah, I really regret I didn't make it clearer that those stages aren't linear. Right, like that those things can happen simultaneously or not even in the same order. So I will preface that with saying the same thing here. So I'm trying to be mindful of my time. So let's look at these last two slides together. So as I mentioned earlier, I also, as a fledgling, faculty member, this actually came out right after I graduated. So I graduated, I had a life that wasn't academia, but that's an administrator before I actually became a faculty member later. And then I had these degrees, and then I worked, and then I went back to graduate school. And so this was my first publication as a doctoral student before I got a job. So I was very excited about this. And so this actually appears in the Routledge Handbook on the genocide. And one thing I've noticed, and I'll point this out to you again later, is that I've seen more invitations to actually participate in these edited volumes because there seems to be this recognition that religion is an important element. To the point that when I was invited, and I was telling my friend Shiloh about this, when I was invited last year, about a year and a half ago to participate in this, I literally, David Simon and I did not know each other personally, but he literally writes to me and goes, I hear you're the genocide and religious scholar. And what's that?
I said, it's true.
It's true. And that I need you in this book, right? And so that was amazing for me as a scholar to know that level of recognition. But it was more important to me that there's this recognition in the field, right, amongst people who put together these volumes, how important an element that is. And so this was kind of one of my first attempts to try to talk about religion and genocide as a graduate student. And here I talk about warrants or frameworks. And so this again goes back to things like ideology, to things like I mentioned before, you're looking at texts or parochial reading of texts as justifications for why you might exterminate a group, because it's kind of certainty that you have from those texts that frames that and allows that to happen. The alterity comes with the us versus them, the demonization of peoples. this idea that they're subhuman or that they even threaten the cosmic order in some way. What's interesting about this is that there's usually a focus on Christianity, right? And we saw that, for instance, because of white supremacy and because of what we see during the Crusades, is that there is this typical emphasis on Christianity. But that's not to say that this doesn't exist in other traditions, right? We see this in Buddhism, right? We see this in Myanmar. And we also see this actually even within some of the indigenous traditions. And this is something I think Taylor does beautifully. Christopher Taylor, is that he has a book called Sacrifices Terror. And there he actually looks at some of the indigenous beliefs within Rwanda. So they also were connected to Christianity. And one of the ways that he does this is that this concept of Imana, and this is Kinyarwanda is a language. So in Rwanda, this word Imana, which means basically it's a fecunding, fluid that comes from the heavens, and that you have a leader from which that should pass, right? So the idea is that, and this is really common in a lot of religious traditions, which is that the health of the leader mirrors the health of the community. And so if the leader is an open conduit for this fecunding fluid to go through him, it should go through him and then benefit the community. Well, what was really interesting was that during the Rwandan genocide, all these images came out, like leading up to the genocide. And one of them was strikingly using religious imagery, but it was using both a concept of Imana as well as religious imagery. And I chose not to, so we were talking about this earlier, I chose not to show you the graphic image of it, but I will describe it to you, which is that it actually has the leader of Burundi. So when we talk about Rwanda and the shooting down of the plane of Habayarwara, but there was also the president of Burundi was also on the plane with him. And although typically we say a genocide didn't break out in Burundi. And so he was killed, and there's an image of him that's actually impaled from anus to mouth. But he's also kind of splayed out. And what's interesting is that it's doing two things. He looks like he's crucified, right? Because he's got this cross. So it has this like Christian imagery. But the fact that he's impaled from anus to mouth shows that he's a blocked being, which means that he's not an effective conduit of a monarch. And this happens several times throughout the conflict, right? With some of the ways in which people were violated. And so one of the things that's really interesting about this alterity is how it's not just all of Christianity, right? There are all other elements that are often a part of it. And that group is seen as a threat, like I said, to the cosmic order. Within the case of Bosnia, there was a sense that there were these Turks, that these bodies who were just incapable, right, of actually becoming Christians, and that they were a threat to all Christendom, right, and that they had to be eliminated. Right, so that alterity, that demonization of that other group is also a way in which you sometimes see religious rhetoric, ideologies playing a role. The last two, I also mentioned, are usurping, it's a usurping of power, that there is a very kind of potent language that comes with couching things in religious terms that can be very motivating for people, and not excusing, at least, for people. And so I also talk a bit about that and about religious rhetoric in some of my writing. And then last is the actual like endorsement or authorization. And so the idea is that, well, we all heard like the Milgram experiments, right? Or this idea that as long as somebody else will take responsibility for it, like I could participate in this. Very similar, right? You have people who will go to altars to be blessed, for instance, after going out and killing, right? So oftentimes if there's an endorsement by religious actors and institutions, that also can be a way in which we see an intersection of these conflicts. Two things that I'll mention, because I think that they're important. One of them is that, especially when it comes to alterity, is that another way in which we see religion involved is through forced conversion. And so you sometimes will see, you saw this during the Holocaust, you see this in the Armenian genocide, for instance, where people are forced to convert to the tradition of the group that's trying to exterminate them. And I think it's also important to mention that when it comes to endorsement and particular figures, this relates to rescue behavior, is that we see that going on in lots of conflicts now, like in Ukraine, for instance, right, with Kirill, right? This kind of idea of people being blessed, after they've engaged in warfare. So where I'll leave it so that we can have a little bit of time for questions is on 2 slides. So this is now me going to the third part of the presentation. So what have I seen, right? So as a scholar who does religion and genocide studies, as somebody who very, again, thankfully has, talked to the State Department, right? Somebody who's, talked to, to think tanks, like what's kind of going on? And so for your further reading, and so I specifically put this here so you can see them all at once. I'm happy to send this to you. You can take pictures of it, because one of the things I love about going to these kinds of events, and I see some of you writings, you want to know, like, I want to read more about that, right? And so I want you to actually be able to kind of visually see it unfolding the way that I see it as a scholar. So I mentioned before that there have been many people who have mentioned, well, religion and genocide is really doesn't seem to be something we talk about a lot. Well, in 2001, this is a piece by Bartov and Matt, was probably one of the first pieces that I can remember where you have a specific volume dedicated to religion and genocide, with multiple people from backgrounds contributing. And so again, that's not to say there had been great books before that were focused on specific conflict and religion, right? I'm saying one that kind of writ large really tries to focus on religion and genocide. This was, I think, one of the. One thing I'll share with you too, which you might find surprising, is that another really definitive book kind of in the field of genocide studies is a book that came out in 1988, I think, which is The Widening of the Circle by Israel Churn. And what's often quoted when we talk about religion and genocide, he says, when I was trying to put this book together, I actually asked people to contribute, from a religious perspective or to talk about religion and genocide, because Widening the Circle was about literally bringing all these different people, an interdisciplinary approach to talking about genocide. He goes, and all the people who were going to write something about religion back out. What's with that? Right? And so he speculates that people really were concerned about writing about religion in ways that might implicate their own traditions. And so that many of them just said, yeah, I'll do it. And they're like, no, never mind. Right? And so another thing that's interesting is that Doris Bergen, who I mentioned before, just recently, actually, as about a year ago, she was on a panel and she said, it's funny that religion is usually not the framework for talking about the Holocaust, which at first might seem weird. But what she means by that is she goes, and I think, and she's speculating, I think there are two reasons for that. She says, one is that maybe it has to do with the fact that because we talk so much about ethnicity, right? So Judaism as an ethnicity, that you don't want to sideline or somehow downplay that by actually talking about Judaism as a tradition, right? She says, so maybe that's one of the reasons why. She said the other one might be is that you don't want to be seen as Christian bashing, right? This idea that we're just always going to focus on Christianity is always forward, right? She says, but it's usually not the framework for talking about the Holocaust, which you might find surprising. And so the fact that we have this book is pretty remarkable. It comes out in 2001. In 2009, we have this book called Confronting Genocide. And again, all these are looking at multiple and then looking at components of religion and all of them. This book, which comes out in 2010, and by the way, in here, all this is in here, right? So this chapter that I wrote in this volume that came out in March, all of this, what I talk about here is in this chapter. In more detail, because here clearly I'm just kind of giving you a little amuse-bouche, right? a little taste of what's in the chapter, and I break it out actually into decades, right? So I kind of say this decade, this is going on. This decade, this seems to be going on, right? And then now in the 2020s, this seems to be going on, right? So that's how I organize it in the text. But in this particular piece in 2010. It's one of the first attempts I ever saw at trying to systematically talk about how religious actors and institutions are involved in reconciliation, like Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, which I think is quite remarkable, and wrestling with theodicy and wrestling with how do we not understand our own traditions that have been implicated, right? There was a lot of talk between Christian and Jews, right, after the Holocaust, like, how do I go on believing as a Jew after the Holocaust? What does it mean for Christianity after the Holocaust? And by the way, sometimes that concealment part about religion means apologies that are kind of, mush mouth. And I was like, well, so for instance, for the anniversary of We Remember the Shoah, right, is coming up. And it's like, well, there were individual bad actors who were involved, but there's really no acknowledgement of the anti-Judaism that we see within the Christian tradition and its connection to anti-Semitism, right? There's a sense of, well, it was about the tradition and not about the people. Or there's not like a real full-throated apology for the institution. It's more like they were some bad or rogue actors. And so here, there's an emphasis on the good that they can do, but oftentimes you also see an unwillingness to really talk about their own implication in these events. This is a special report that came out by Samantha Powers called Burning Hell on Earth. This is by the Institute of Peace. And so it was a UN special report. Samantha Powers also wrote a book that you might remember too called Problem from Hell, which was looking more largely at warfare. But here, again, there's clearly an interest involving religious actors in prevention, and she tries to lay that out in this brief. We have Jihad and Genocide, which is referencing Islam and its connection to genocidal violence. That's in 2010. There was a special issue that came out in 2017, 2018, which was a specific focus on religion and genocide. That wasn't that long ago, right? And I actually participated in that particular one. This is the role of religious leaders in preventing incitement that could lead to genocide. This was actually put out by the UN in concert with the Office of Genocide Prevention. I actually wrote a chapter about this that appears in this book, where I basically analyze this document and what I think is great about it and what I think maybe is kind of problematic about it. So this again was a clear interest involving religious actors in genocide prevention. Some of those ways, by the way, are things like, raising alarm flags, like when you see something going on, an uptick in religious rhetoric that really seems to be hateful, right? So those are the kind, when they talk about how can religious actors be involved, education, right? Trying to have more dialogue, right, between competing groups. I often think one of the things that's problematic though about these documents is that there seems to be a presumption that religion is a good thing at the beginning, right? There isn't an acknowledgement that's ambivalent. It's like religion is a good thing, it just gets twisted, right? Or there isn't as much of an acknowledgement as I would like of the fact that there's actually conversations that need to be happening, like how do you help make sure that the people of your traditions are less likely to be radicalized, right? As opposed to like always feeling like you have to have these dialogues with other groups. This one was a theological roundtable in 2020 about how theologians should respond to genocide. This was, I mentioned, came out as a handbook, of which I have a chapter that actually analyzes this, that came out in 2022. Stephen Jacobs, who I showed, he was the fourth model I showed earlier, he has a book that just came out this year called Religion and Genocide, Changing the Conversation. And of course, I mentioned that there's a chapter in this book that I wrote that just came out this past month, right? So all this is to say, and I'm wrapping up now here in a minute, is that it seems to be, if you saw that, it's kind of like a trickle, right? It's like, oh, 2001, and then something kind of comes out again in 2009, and okay, stuff starts picking up in 2010, right? You kind of see things kind of coming out, but then there does seem to be this uptick that starts happening like in 2019, 20, 21, 22, and that's why I'm saying this post-secular term comes in, right? As a person who has been invited to do these kinds of talks and to write, and the fact that I do have non-governmental organizations asking me to speak, like there seems to be something going on, right? And so, and I'm choosing to call this a kind of post-secular term because when, again, talking to say it to other people, they will readily tell you. Also, there's a ministerial to advance religious freedom that also happened in 2019, which is also the state department that I went to. And there, as well as what Greg has mentioned, is that most people were alert. Like, look at Rwanda. Oh my gosh, what a disaster. Why would you do disasters, right? But certainly that's been changing. And so the last thing that I'll share, and I'll just point this out because we're kind of running out of time, is I kind of talk about, there's always this question about secularism and has religion died? And so I kind of put up here kind of tongue in cheek, right? It's like, yeah, we think that religion's dead. You see this whole Time article in 66, right? And then I say, but with Habermas's piece in 2008, we're like, well, secularism dead, post-secularism. And so I'll just highlight these one or two things here is that, okay, so what do I see in genocide studies? And then what do I see in genocide prevention? So rather than talk about all of them, I'll just talk about maybe one or two that you might find interesting. One of them is the questioning of the potential prevention of genocide in general, like whether you involve religious actors or not. Part of this has to do with the fact that if you look at models where we look at all the potential triggers, right, or all the elements that seem to be present that are common amongst genocides, and if you try to use that as a forecasting model, you'll find out that those conditions will exist in a lot of situations where genocide never breaks out, right? And so it's kind of like, well, how can a model is that? So you have people like McLaughlin who are trying to look at, well, let's not look at what all those genocides have in common. Let's look at communities that have all those elements, but violence never breaks out, right? That seems to be more, to be more helpful. And I'm wondering to what extent religious harmony or religious actors or a strong civil kind of community, I'm wondering like what element that might play. The other one is, and this is where I'll end, is that there's also some question about how we think about rescue behavior. So you'd be surprised that religion is often not the reason that people cite as to why they might actually be involved in rescue behavior. And I'm going to kind of use these two things and I'll close. One of them is, if you look at Helen Fine, she wrote a book called Accounting Genocide, Accounting for Genocide. I think it's in 17. And she makes this really interesting argument, which is, which I made earlier, which is that religious traditions can be the difference whether whether a campaign is successful or not. And she specifically cites like Denmark and Bulgaria during the Holocaust. And she says, well, in situations where a dominant religion spoke out, and so here's the two things that are important about this: a dominant tradition, and one that spoke out either right before or right at the beginning of deportations, usually many Jews were spared, right? So clearly there's a dominant tradition and they're doing it thoroughly, right? So in that sense, there seems to be some promise there. But on the flip side, there's a book that came out by Braun that actually looks at religious pluralism, and he looks at religious actors in the Low Countries. So he's specifically looking at places like the Netherlands and Belgium. And when he looks at those areas, he said, you know what, actually, it's not actually the religious traditions that they cite, it's the fact that they're a minority tradition within their communities. That's actually the reason why they involve rescue behavior. So once the dominant religion, right, defined, here in Braun, he's saying because those religious communities that are minorities, they empathize with, with persecution with these other minority groups. And then second, they're less susceptible to penetration, like of spies, right, into their small, more close-knit communities. And they can more easily trust and mobilize in ways that some of these larger institutions can't. But it really has little to do, they don't cite their actual content of the religious belief. It's their minority status that actually makes it more likely that they'll intervene. And then there's some work that just came out about the Rwandan Genocide, for instance, the Muslims who assisted. And one of the reasons that's cited there is because they were because they don't drink, right? Like a lot of communities were involved in these, kind of drunken raids, and alcohol was sometimes used as a factor to help people forget what they were doing. And so, well, many of those communities were also minority, and they also didn't drink, right? And so they were also less susceptible to, what's that?
So drunk on genocide.
Yeah, they were also less susceptible. So what's interesting is that religion often isn't cited as the reason. There are qualities about that tradition that actually make it more likely. So I will leave it there, and I really thank you for your time and attention.
So much, Kate. That was wonderful. You've given us a lot to think about, and covered a lot of very analytically difficult terrain in a really accessible way. That was a remarkable teaching demonstration as well. We've got a few minutes for questions or conversation, comments. Would you like to field them yourself?
Yes, I think I said.
So thank you again for very informative. I'm not a scholar of that particular area, so I'm not familiar with the literature, but here's my question to you.
Sure.
As we think about Genocide Awareness Week and where we go in the future, what do you think is still missing or needs more attention in the discourse of genocide studies? It doesn't have to be just from the religious perspective, but since you know the terrain so well, what do you think is important?
Okay, gotcha. So what do I think is important to pay attention? So I think there's a couple things. And this again is coming from, and where a lot of this is coming from is, again, because the field is still kind of evolving, there have been these periodic like focus issues where we say like, where we take stock of what we're not doing. And one of them definitely has to do with trying to generalize some of the work that we're doing within genocide studies to other contexts. And so, for instance, applying it to white genocide, right? And like, how can it be helpful there? Or applying it to other mass atrocities and using the framework within genocide studies in order to understand some of these other elements. Another one actually has to do with language. We're really starting to see genocide studies change in ways we've never seen before, because of increasing interdisciplinarity, because usually it was a territory like historians, political scientists, and now we have more people who are kind of coming to the table, but also because it's largely been an English-speaking field. And so now that we're starting to see more text being translated and more international scholars who are coming to the table, that's kind of like the next, I think, big area is really trying to make this a more global phenomenon in ways that it hasn't before. Yeah. Were you gonna go? No, go ahead.
Finish.
Oh, okay. So I see. So I think that would be one. And then I think another one is, again, expanding the canon, right? This kind of critical genocide studies is that we really do need to get away from almost solely focusing on Rwanda and Bosnia, right? And start talking more about those what are called like lesser known genocides. And I think we're also getting away from sticking to the UN definition, right? Increasingly, people are coming up with more kind of inclusive, expansive ideas of genocide that also aid the ability to talk about its applicability or how it can be useful in other contexts, besides just this kind of hyper kind of idea of what we think a genocide is. So I think that's another element that we're seeing. So hopefully, is that helpful? Yeah. Oh, great. Yeah.
Bringing it back to religious studies.
Okay.
So, as you've noted, religion and genocide are both very difficult to define.
Yeah.
Both fields do not have consensus definitions and very fluid. You've also pointed out in your work too, right? That even though we don't have a lot of religious studies and, there's an uptick in it, but we're, the nexus that you're talking about is emerging. But religious studies is so multidisciplinary, it is a great way to bring together a lot of the stuff that, like, I think we have real opportunity and moment, which I'm glad. And I do agree that you are the religion and genocide person, and also someone who's on the religion, Holocaust, and genocide unit at the AAR. Are you seeing an uptick in proposals for your unit? And what kind of stuff are you seeing? Where do you see this field going? Is here at ASU, these are courses I'm trying to teach, more like religion and genocide. That's and I really think religious studies has a lot to bring and contribute to genocide studies with just how multidisciplinary religious studies is.
It's true. I mean, that's that argument, my dissertation. So Sydney, so we've actually seen ebbs and flows of actual submissions to the unit. I'm happy to say that the submissions this past March, which will be the basis for the sessions, I'll be this November, because it's always held in November every year, there was an uptick, which was nice. And so I can just tell you some of the things that we saw. So one of them, there was a focus on colonialism, right? So there's been this increasing comparison of talking about the, like for instance, the Holocaust within a colonial context. We've seen more about religious minorities. So trying to, and this is something I was going to say up there, but I didn't get to, and this actually goes to your question, is like actually going back and looking at the more well-trodden kind of genocide cases and looking at elements of religion in those, right? Whereas before, like maybe there was other, kind of foci. It's like, well, actually there might be something to say substantial about religion's involvement in a conflict that otherwise we didn't really think of as one that would be a good case study. Somebody brought this up at a meeting a couple of days ago. We saw one on video games. Yeah, we did see a submission of kind of looking at particular video games. And then one of the other ones, one of the other panels was looking at, the commemoration of the Shoah, which is, we remember the Shoah, which is the statement that was put out by the Vatican as a way of trying to reconcile with their Jewish brethren. So those were, I think those were like 3 or 4 of the different topics that seemed to be of interest.
So it's kind of aligning with critical genocide studies too, like breaking away from the canon and going more into what we call like periphery.
To more peripheral kind of cases.
Genocides, just hidden and forgotten genocides.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that would be true.
And I think critical genocide studies and religious studies go. It's a very nice pair. It
is. And for myself, I've also, and I'm just speaking for myself, I'm not saying I am a trend unto myself, but I've also tried to do more of that. And that's what I call the triangulation. I've tried to do more religion, genocide, and I'm wondering if that's also going to be so I do religion, genocide, and sexual violence, or religion, genocide, and white genocide in America, or I've also been trying to think more about how statistically genocides actually aren't that common. Right. So then how can we talk about it in ways that apply to more everyday things that we're dealing with? Where are the insights that we offer? I think I saw at least two other. hands.
Last, need to be the last question.
Oh, sure, sure. I'll talk to you afterward. How about that? Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned that a lot of the language of reconciliation is loaded with religious terms.
Yeah.
And that's interesting also because many of the societies where this is happening are very secular societies.
Yes.
Say, for example, Germany, where the church plays a very small role, and one thing that is interesting to me is the concept of redemption here. It goes back right to Adorno, right? I mean, we remember in order to forget, right? Or to be allowed to forget. So, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the role of redemption in these kind of very ritualized memory activities that are loaded with this kind of very redemptive and I think very based in religious language. And this is happening in very secular society where at least institutionalized religion plays increasingly less and less of a role. So redemption in secular society and genocide.
Okay, gotcha. I like that question. So I think probably one of, and this is a piece that I co-wrote with a gentleman who's a theory of history person. He's actually at Ghent University. And so we actually wrote this piece about how people use history to reconcile.
Yeah.
And so we talked about these different models, and one of them does include this model that's often includes religious language. And sometimes it's the history is used as a way of saying we're going to recover what actually happened. Like we can't redeem ourselves, and so we're all honest about what actually happened, right? And so there's this like recovery of the truth. So we all have to agree on what happened. And then you also have these other models that say, well, we don't all have to agree on what happened, but we do have to have like maybe one or two different sanction models for how we're going to move forward. And that model will either be that we have competing models, right? Or that we can all frankly kind of make up our own history and agree on it. And sometimes that can involve religious rhetoric, where there's this sense that like the South Africa model will be a good one, where like Desmond Tutu very much use religious language of redemption, but you basically cobble together your own revisionist history as a model for moving forward in your redemption, which sometimes downplay the perpetrators, right? And it also didn't necessarily need to be based on acknowledgement of wrongdoing in order to move on to that redemption. The last one that I'll share, because I know we're at time, had to do with, you know what? We don't need to actually be a part of your model. We're just going to have like the subaltern communities that say like, we just have our own model over here, and we actually don't need you to rubber stamp it, right? Like this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to heal. And our redemption is not based on this kind of more elaborate structural system, societal system. We can do this on our own, right? So I think those have been some of the different models of redemption that I've seen.
Yeah.
That's
Thank you so much.
You're so welcome, and I'll get your question later. How about that? Yeah.
Thanks so much.